Coming up next on Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, inside AMD's Fusion Crysis 2 patch, the pain is back, ARM notebooks are coming, PCI Express cables, consoles versus PCs Part 2, case size Linux trim, and more coming up next on Twitch.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twitch.
Bandwidth for Twitch is provided by Cachefly at cachefly.com.
This is Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, episode 125, recorded June 23rd, 2011. ExaFLOP versus ARM, the future of computing.
This episode of This Week in Computer Hardware is brought to you by Netflix. Watch thousands of TV episodes and movies on your PC, Mac, iPad, iPhone, or TV instantly. All streamed directly to you, saving you time, money, and hassle. For your free 30-day trial, go to netflix.com/twit.
Welcome to Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware. I'm Patrick Norton, joined as always by the man, the myth, and the actually not traveling this week legend, Ryan Shrout at PCPer.com. Ryan, how's it going, man?
Doing pretty well. This is 1 week in a row, I believe, that I have not been on the road. I'm looking forward to 2 weeks, probably even 3 weeks in a row. 4 might be a stretch. We'll see what happens.
4 would be epic, an epic change in your lifestyle. It's actually an interesting week. Like PCI Express cables, ExaFLOP supercomputers, but you want to talk about the new AMD Fusion system architecture, or sort of an overview, if you will.
Yeah, so this was kind of, when we did the episode of Twitch, we recorded it while I was at the AMD Fusion Developer Summit. This information more or less was released the next day, so I just wanted to kind of briefly mention it, even though it is pushing on that 1 week old news, and we don't want to bore anybody that's maybe read through it already. But if you were at all interested in the kind of deep dive technical information, deep dive technical architectural information about GPUs and what the future of AMD GPUs is going to be like, you should definitely check out an article that one of the writers at PC Perspective put up, Josh Walrath. It's titled AMD Fusion System Architecture Overview, Southern Isle GPUs and Beyond. And what's interesting about this is two things. They talk about the general purpose 3-year out plan for where AMD sees the GPU architecture fitting into the computing architecture as a whole. If you're not a big programming nerd, or you don't understand a lot of technical, maybe semantics, like when we talk about GPU compute context switching, or GPU graphics preemption, or maybe even something like fully coherent memory between the CPU and GPU. These are all things that do not exist today that will benefit heterogeneous computing platforms of the future, and AMD more or less kind of went over how they were planning on integrating that into future technologies. And what's interesting about this, Fusion System Architecture, FSA is what they're calling it, is very much, in my mind, like an architectural shift in the way that we move to 64-bit processors and the way that we move to on-die memory controllers. And it's interesting that AMD is kind of going out on a limb here, because they're the only vendor that has high-quality x86 cores, high-quality GPU cores, all on the same die. Sandy Bridge exists, but the GPU cores aren't level, right? And the GPU cores aren't capable of the same type of general-purpose computing that AMD's GPUs have been, and now obviously the APUs, but that technology integrated into it. And so they're kind of going out on a limb here because Intel won't necessarily be able to integrate this, or they'll have to make that decision if they want to or not.
Right.
And obviously NVIDIA can't do it without an x86 processor. You remember when 64-bit technology was starting to roll out? AMD was the first person to release it.
Yes.
There was a lot of talk in our industry, in what you were doing and what we were doing, talking about, okay, yes, this is the future. We're going to need 64-bit memory address. We're going to need 64-bit architectures. AMD was the first to have it, but it wasn't very useful when it first came out. Operating systems were still, the majority of them shipped in 32-bit. If you wanted 64-bit, it was kind of like a stretch to get Windows XP 64, those types of things. And Intel kind of jumped on the bandwagon, AMD will say they jumped on late. Intel will say they jumped on when the market was ready for it. And I can't help but see a little bit of an analogy here that AMD is kind of forging this path of CPU and GPU sharing memory, and what this, how it will change heterogeneous computing, how it will change computing in general, and how these types of data flows and computer processing workflows actually work. But whether or not we'll see tons of software developers using them and hardware guys really jumping on to push that without Intel in the ring as well is kind of questionable. And I can't help that what's going to happen is 2 years from now, 3 years from now, Intel will have a very similar kind of plan laid out, and everybody will go, oh yeah, AMD did it first, but now we're going to adopt it. That type of thing. That's the kind of general idea.
Now that the market's ready.
Now that the market's ready, and I mean, it's tough to argue if you've got 75, 85% market share, right? How much can you really push hardware and software developers?
Well, I could also say, is AMD, is AMD doing this more so that they have a brand differentiator for somebody to go like, it's got 100% more dead crab, to make an obscure reference to a certain British comedy show. Some other stuff that's actually really interesting. We're talking about market changes. You linked to a story, Asus rumored to have 13-inch Android laptop on its mind, NVIDIA expected to provide ARM CPU, and then Digitimes, of all places, has a huge article. Basically, headline sends it up. Several vendors plan to offer ARM architecture notebooks, and we're talking about Samsung, Toshiba, Asus, Asus Tech, and Acer, all planning to develop ARM architecture notebooks, all presumably running Android. This is a big deal because this is, or maybe it's not, you know what I mean? Because it's part of me is like, okay, this is the second coming of the netbook, and then the other part of me is like, wow, dual core, quad core ARM processors, running a solid multi-core, basically an operating system that's optimized originally for cell phones and slowly migrating to other platforms. This is interesting.
The idea, when you word it like that, the second coming of the netbook, I couldn't be less excited about where it's going. But you're right in that it is pretty dramatic. The idea here is obviously that these are ARM-based and also still running Windows. Because if you think about it, we kind of already have ARM-based notebooks, at least if you consider the Asus, the one I showed last week, the Asus ePad Transformer, right? So that's actually an Android-based tablet that has a keyboard dock. It kind of more or less becomes a notebook. Doesn't quite have the same feel and functionality as a Windows machine would. That you kind of, what I think is interesting, as I found over the last week, in addition of using it, is that when you attach a keyboard to something with a touchpad, you have certain expectations about what you're going to be allowed to do and what you can do and how how fast things should move, and that doesn't really necessarily happen with the Android OS today. So what's curious is if the Asus rumored laptop and if these other guys, if they are all kind of waiting on that Windows 8, the Windows 8 that Microsoft has announced is going to be running on ARM architectures, if that's kind of the key to getting this, and as you kind of alluded to, what's the benefit really of this? Is the only thing I can really think of is these better have awesome battery life numbers, right? Otherwise, I can run Windows on any Intel platform, any AMD platform, and if I'm getting 10 hours instead of 8 hours, is it worth the performance hit that you may or may not get? But if I'm getting 20 hours instead of 10 hours, now you've got me interested.
Well, it's going to be interesting, right? Because Windows 8 is certainly a game changer because they are specifically designing a version to run on ARM, but. Pardon me. It's really interesting looking at what's going on in terms of Android, how fast Android can mature and whether or not these are going to be something that people like, $300 price points for a 13-inch PC, that's pretty novel. If they have the performance that people expect. Especially, it's also been interesting on kind of a side note watching people freak out and not freak out about how broad or narrow Apple's patent on multi-touch is.
Right.
And whether that's going to allow them to, say, shut out, basically take legal action against other cell phone vendors and or maybe in a bigger sense, kick, Android and Windows 8 as hard as possible.
Agreed. Part of this info mentions that they're talking about an August release for the NVIDIA Cal-L, which is the quad-core ARM-based Tegra processor, and these kind of stories are in the same stream of conscious post here. Obviously, Windows 8 is not going to be available in August, so that would kind of point to another OS, Migo, Android, whatever the other one options there are. That maybe not as appealing, I think, to a lot of people once you actually sit down and use it, unless the quad-core processor is significantly faster and the app ecosystem on Android has kicked up its game for tablets compared to what it is today. Although they do mention sub $299 price points, which is very enticing and should hopefully also maybe have put some pressure on phone vendors for their $599 phone prices as well.
That would be nice.
Yeah, agreed.
Although, you know, the flip side is it's interesting thing about when you're talking about phone vendors, like where that $599 price actually comes from and where it can be trimmed, because you start, you know, learning more about the conditions people are making these phones under in mainland China. It's obviously not labor where all that money's going.
Exactly.
You know, not to laugh at a serious and kind of sad issue, but it's going to be really interesting to see where they manage to cut prices on that hardware in the next couple of years. Intel looking for ExaFLOP capable supercomputers within 10 years. And I keep laughing because it's like supercomputers have been in the news more, and I think in the last 2 months they have been in the last 5 or 8 years.
Right.
Because and again, this is a Silicon Graphics International and Intel making an announcement together, which also like SGI's back, baby. They're back with Cray. Cray's back too. Sorry.
It's so I'm trying to figure out a way to put this in some kind of perspective. If you think about it, the current best processor we have today is a GPU. If you just look at raw teraflops or raw floating point operations, is about a 2-point-something teraflop GPU from AMD. And we're talking about a ExaFLOP, which is 1,000 petaflops, and a petaflop is 1,000 teraflops. So that kind of gives you, we're talking, you know, a magnitude of 1 million type processing power there. Now they're talking about supercomputers, which means not all on a single processor, which means probably not even all in a single room. So we're not talking about a shrink or an increase in performance that dramatic to a single chip. But they do mention, they even actually, this is all kind of based on the design work and the research they did on Larrabee. We've talked about Larrabee for a long time. It was their defunct mini-core x86 processor that was going to be a discrete GPU for the gaming market and the professional market. It never panned out. It was more or less canned by Intel last year, and it wasn't pushed completely away. They still saw this as a good opportunity to take this product into the supercomputing world. And actually, if you look through some of these articles that we've posted recently, you'll see that Intel is showing what they're calling Knight's Ferry and Knight's Corner. Knight's Ferry being it basically looks like a graphics card. It's a PCI Express plug-in card that is, you know, it's meant for secondary computing, much like the Tesla cards and the Fire Pro cards from AMD. But some of the specifications that they're giving for the next generation of part are really, really impressive. Knight's Corner, this is a single chip, will be able to run x86-based software featuring 50 cores based on 22-nanometer manufacturing technology. Each core will run 4 threads, so we're talking 200 threads on a processor at 1.2 gigahertz, have 8 megs of cache, and be supported by a 512-bit vector processing unit.
That's a lot of vector processing.
It's a lot of vector processing. It's a lot of processing power in general. We're talking, you know, above 7.5 teraflops of processing on a single part. That's a whole lot. You know, this is a next generation type product next year for those specs. And if that's the case, that's really, really impressive. Taking advantage of 50 or 200 threads of processing sounds like a software nightmare, except for those very specific supercomputing segments where they have, you know, specifically built applications and platforms for that.
Well, we're also talking about something they're saying is 10 years out.
Well, that's for the ExaFLOP. This one that we talked about, the 50-core, 4 threads per core, 1.2 gigahertz. That's a product they showed a die shot of. That's a product that they said will be available next year. Within reasonable power envelopes and that type of thing. So that's still pretty impressive. It's still whether or not it'll actually pan out to anything, maybe all that research that they did in these mini-core processors is going to turn into more than just not so great ray tracing demos at IDF.
So, Crysis 2. Everybody's like, Crysis, it's not the benchmark anymore with Crysis 2. It's not going to be the thing that GPU reviewers always talk about. And then the DX11 patch was about to happen.
It's about to. I just thought I'd throw this in there for people who are interested in that type of thing.
The benchmarking thing.
The benchmarking thing, that if you have a DX11 capable graphics card, which I think a lot of our audience does, you want things to take advantage of it. And the new Crysis 1.9 patch and high texture res pack is going to be released, I think, within a few days, maybe
I think
maybe
they said
another
Monday.
week. That's within a few days in my count. It's they're going to offer some cool DX11 features like tessellation, displacement mapping, high quality HDR motion blur, improved depth of field, parallax occlusion mapping. These types of DX11 features and performance enhancements that may improve the visual quality of Crysis 2, which I think a lot of people will like, and maybe improve performance as well. And maybe they'll include a little bit extra there that, like maybe another extra stepping on your graphical features that will just destroy your hardware, because apparently that's what people want to see if it has the name Crysis.
I bought Crysis to hurt my machine. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because part of me is like, wow, what does it take to actually generate a higher resolution texture pack for a game? Do they have to re-render every single element of the game and make that a download? But the thing is, if you want to start really educating yourself about the finer points of 3D rendering, just go look at the change list on the PCPro.com article, where it's like, the patch includes like, additions on tessellation and displacement mapping, HDR motion blur, variable penumbra for realistic shadows, sprite-based broken depth of field, parallax occlusion mapping, particle motion blur, shadows, and it's like, water rendering improvements using tessellation and displacement mapping. You could spend a good weekend just reading up on how tessellation and displacement mapping work. Not even get into HDR motion blur, and then and at that point you're going to be going back and saying, what's a sprite? And then you're going to rebuild your entire understanding of rendering and how it works.
If you're a graphics nerd, it's really cool to just see that they are very specifically putting time and effort into those effects, things that NVIDIA and NVIDIA and AMD really, they push those heavily when they launch new cards. Here's all these cool things you can do with our graphics card, and it takes a developer like Crytek, in this case maybe a little bit longer than some people wanted, to really implement those features and take advantage of the hardware, and I think we're going to see that in this instance. So that should be pretty cool.
Yeah, no, it's also funny when you think about when you're buying a bleeding edge graphics card, when they release a new generation of chip with new features in it, you're really buying, they're releasing those features now so that there will be software to run those features 2 years from now when everybody can afford the technology that you're tapping into. It's, when your $600 card is a $200 card 2 to 3 years from now, or a year and a half from now, hopefully there will be software that actually takes advantage of those features.
Now, another interesting thing we saw this week is an improvement to PCI Express cables, which is kind of interesting. This kind of filters into the Thunderbolt versus PCI Express battle, although they're still kind of tied together. They apparently have a PCI Special Interest Group, PCI SIG, annual meeting, and they announced plans for a 32 gigabit per second PCIe cable. External cable, right? So we're not talking about an internal connection. We're talking about an external cable, right?
That kind of bums me when you think about that, because like as soon as I saw PCI Express cable, all I could think of was now I can mount a high-end GPU in a really tiny case without having to figure out if I can fit a 90-degree riser card to stuff the card inside that case.
That's true. So they're targeting consumer applications. The cable is very small. Maybe they're even talking about tablet devices and these ultra-thin laptops. So it's meant to fit into that same style, that same target that maybe Apple and Intel went with in the Thunderbolt technology. And then they also talked a little bit about PCI Express 4.0 and potentially optical data conveyance, which was the original premise of LightPeak being a light optic etc. based technology instead of just electrical.
It's funny. I mean, other than Thunderbolt, was there any motivation for the PCI Special Interest Group to put this together? Or are they purely just saying, like, Thunderbolt's stupid, we already have a great bus standard, let's build on that?
Well, Thunderbolt uses PCI Express to just add more stuff on. So I think this instance of it's kind of their annual meeting, right? It wasn't anything that they got together specifically for. It was more like, okay, here, we're moving things forward. We're going to have these technologies. You don't have to go through this special kind of branding like Thunderbolt and use mini DisplayPort type connectors. Here's the technology. Here's how it can work for the masses as opposed to very specific and small groups. So, and they, like I said, they also talked about PCI Express 4, and since we haven't even really seen PCI Express 3.0 in anything yet, they're dedicated. They're just focused on moving the standard forward, making sure that our data rates aren't a bottleneck for any of our computing tasks at any time in the future.
And before we start getting into the questions and thank our sponsor, I want to take a moment that Nevada has passed a law authorizing driverless cars. Assembly Bill number 511 in the state of Nevada. No. This is important. Authorizes the Department of Transportation to develop rules and regulations governing the use of driverless cars, such as Google's concept car on its road. That's up on the Forbes blog. As Stanford professor Ryan Kalo notes, this is a big step forward in ensuring that safe driverless cars become a reality, because you got to test these things somewhere.
Sure.
Specifically, quote, the law provides that the Nevada Department of Transportation shall adopt regulations authorizing the operation of autonomous vehicles on the highways within the state of Nevada. And actually requires it to designate areas where driverless cars may be tested. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens, because part of me is convinced that basically Google wanted someplace relatively empty to test their cars, even though they've been.
That makes sense,
because they had to work with the California Department, or the California, I want to say the DMV and CalDOT to get permission to start testing these vehicles in California. And the fact that they've been running in Northern California, in the areas they've been running the driverless cars, is amazing, because this part of the country is a nightmare. In terms of traffic.
For traffic? Oh, yeah.
And traffic and human stupidity behind the wheel. The whole concept, it's interesting. Like, I figure if these vehicles can operate safely in Northern California, they're probably safe anywhere. But I just think it's fascinating to watch this entire segment of the market go from fantasy to, holy crap, Google's got 25 of these cars running around Northern California, to, wow, legislation to help implement driverless cars is coming. So hopefully, I don't know, either that or it's another sign of the robot apocalypse that is coming, Terminator style, and that Google is Skynet.
It's only an apocalypse for us. It's only an apocalypse for us. For them, it's a revolution. So
everybody needs a hobby.
Exactly. Let's take a quick break here. Thank today's podcast sponsor. That would be Netflix. Netflix streams thousands of TV episodes and movies directly to you instantly, which means you save time, money, and hassle. There are several ways to instantly access these streaming movies and TV shows with Netflix. You can watch Netflix movies and TV shows on your Mac or PC or an iPad as well. You can watch them on your iPhone and some Android phones too. I know, for example, my HTC Evo 4G has been recently added to the okayed list here. And of course, you can watch Netflix right on your TV via an Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, or Nintendo Wii. If you're not a gamer, you can watch Netflix on your TV with an Apple TV box or Roku box. They're inexpensive and very easy to use. With Netflix, you can watch movies and TV shows instantly using any of these devices, and you can begin watching a movie or show on one device and then finish it on a different one. So even if you don't know what the benefits of a multi-room DVR are, you get some of those with this as well. Whichever way you choose to access Netflix, you can watch as many movies and time you want. And you can cancel at any time if you're not happy with the service, although we are pretty sure you will be. Try Netflix today, 30 days free. Go to netflix.com/twit. Be sure to use this URL when you sign up for the free trial, netflix.com/twit, TWIT. And we thank Netflix for their support of This Week in Tech and This Week in Computer Hardware. And we hope you enjoy watching instantly with Netflix.
Woohoo! First email of the day we got from Dean. He says, I had a bit of a laugh when I heard someone thinks that the 360 can play the latest games. Sure it can if you don't mind running them at 720p or less. Any half-decent geek knows that the GTX 460 is immensely more powerful than any console. As far as the 360 GPU versus the PS3's GPU, the 360 has effectively a 1900 XT, which is slightly more powerful than the 7900 GT equivalent found in the PS3, though the cell processors probably help even things out. However, I have a PS3, and being primarily a PC gamer and used to 2560 by 1440, it makes my eyes bleed when I occasionally play it. Here ends the locker room talk, Dean.
No real question there. I thought it was interesting. First of all, I always like it when people go back in history and remember things like the Radeon 1900 XT and the GeForce 7900 GT. I seem to remember the 7900 GT being a little bit better of a GPU than the 1900 XT, but we're talking about years ago's GPUs. We're not going to get into an argument there. I guess this stemmed from an email we had last week where they talked about, a GTX 460 and whether or not their consoles were outpacing them. A GTX 460 is faster than any of the GPUs on the consoles. It's all a matter of utilization, how well the programmers and that kind of stuff take advantage of it. It was interesting. We had this discussion among some of my friends talking about the new Nintendo Wii U GPU being based on a 4000 series Radeon GPU. So where does that put that in the line of things? It's faster than the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3, but how slow is it compared to GPUs of today? I would say that the GTX 460 is faster than it. Maybe and anything above that definitely would be on the NVIDIA side. And then Radeon 5000 series, 6000 series, we're still a couple of generations ahead of where Nintendo's new console will be when it comes out next year, I guess. Surely not by the end of this year, but Nintendo's kind of stuck in that realm of let's use older parts, and we'll still see. Obviously, Microsoft is going to come out with a new console. Sony's going to come out with a new console. Maybe they'll talk about it by the end of this year, maybe not, and we'll see where that is in line with things. I think when the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 were announced and shown, their GPUs were fairly advanced. Right. And that was kind of like the first time that it happened in a console where the console performance met or exceeded where we were at on the PC side. It was almost exciting for PC gamers because we thought, oh, here's this huge audience, so they're going to be able to target, bigger audiences and be able to, get higher resolution, better looking games. And that was true at first. And then as PCs progressed and consoles obviously remained static in terms of their processing power, now we're on the other route where the console ports coming over are less impressive, perhaps, than we would like them to be.
Well, we should actually, maybe this is a good time to segue into another question that was coming up in the show today is, where did it go? Steve has questions about upgrade cycles in a console world. He says, I wondered what your thoughts are on video game upgrades in light of the fact that most games these days are DX9 console ports. First of all, I'm not sure I agree with that. I'm a longtime gamer, Steve says, who used to upgrade to a newer video card at least once a year to keep up with the advances in new gaming technology. But now, with the 6 years of stagnation in the gaming industry and a lack of innovation, I've seen no reason to upgrade my 2-year-old 295 GTX. I'm encouraged by the news that Battlefield 3 will be DX11 and PC-based, however. Would it be worth finally upgrading to a newer card at this time, or would it be better off sticking with what I have for now and saving $500? Thanks, guys. I look forward to your show every week. Thank you, Steve. I think also we should point out is that monitor resolutions were increasing much, much faster into the last couple of years because, we've hit 1920 by 1080.
Goodness.
Try to kill myself on air. We've kind of plateaued at 1080p for desktop monitors, which
makes me sad. Yeah,
it's actually really depressing, and there's a lot of reasons behind that. Partially because vendors aren't particularly interested in making a lot of 30-inch 2560 by 1440 monitors when they can make, they can sell like 8 of those to the computer industry, but they can sell like 80,000 of those for, I guess, kitchen HD TVs.
Right.
So the economies of scale aren't there.
I mean, that's very true, actually. I hadn't even thought about how the monitor cycle at the same time. I'm guessing when the GTX 295 or the 295 GTX came out that Steve is using, which is a dual GPU NVIDIA card, very high-end video card at the time, I would bet 1280 by 1024 was a resolution that most people had on their displays. And when you think about the increase from that to 19 by 10, not as dramatic as maybe we would have liked. Did we lose Patrick? He's still there. I'm assuming he's going off to get some water. I will say that are most games today DX9 console ports? Unfortunately, yes, the majority of them are. I was also used to the once-a-year upgrade cycle. It is not necessary right now. It's very possible that when we get this next generation of consoles, we will kind of return to that, at least for a period. Right. Games like Battlefield 3, those will help. Seeing patches like we just talked about with Crysis 2 will also help, but I don't think we're out of it completely. I think much as we found in the CPU gigahertz race, we've kind of reached this plateau where it's like, okay, this is good enough for this. We need some other type of processing, some other problem that we could address with GPUs, much than we did with the CPUs when we went to multi-core, then now heterogeneous computing. So I think there will still be an instance where that happens, but I think we need to wait for the consoles to kind of catch up a little bit here before they'll be willing to take that next leap.
I also wonder if it's partially the consoles catching up and how much of it is going to be. It'll be interesting to see if the consoles catch up and if the graphics don't take a big leap on the television or on the computer side of things, just because most people have 1080p monitors or less on their desktops. Yep. And if it's, if we have to wait until, the monitors take a leap, if half of America is running a 2560 monitor, then all of a sudden, 1920 graphics are going to look kind of by comparison to 1080p graphics. I agree.
I mean, there's only so much you can do to those 2 million pixels of a 1080p screen to get them to look that much better. Yeah. Right? Whereas if you have, let me do my math here, 4 million pixels, over 4 million pixels on a 30-inch display, you get a lot more detail out of it.
I know there are people laughing right now, but if you think about it, for years and years and years and years, your desktop PC monitor was considerably higher resolution than your television was. And then all of a sudden you get to this point where everybody's got like a 42, 47-inch HDTV in their living room, and it's the same resolution as their desktop machine. And I laugh, but it's like I've tried using a 37-inch, 42-inch HDTV as a desktop monitor, but the resolution is not high enough to enjoy it unless you put it at the far end of a very long table. So I don't know. Again, I want to find an inexpensive 30-inch flat panel that's got a higher resolution, and I think once those start showing up in volume, if they ever do, that's going to be a big trigger. Brent is
before we do that, hold on. I did want to. Well, there was one. This is not a question again, and kind of another point that somebody brought up, Ben, about trim and Linux. We had several emails about this. I want to make sure.
Sorry, my bad. I jumped down to get the Steve thing.
Yeah. He says, I thought that I would let you know that Linux has supported trim on the ext4 formatted disk since kernel 2.6.33, released February 2010. So if your questioner has gotten a recent distro disk and formatted his SSD to ext4, he is golden. The distros have made a big push to have under 60-second cold boots off rotating disks. The SSD is not going to give him much less unless he's doing a database or some other disk-intensive work. Had a Wikipedia link where they talk about that as well. GNOME will do fancy effects with Compiz, but that might need the proprietary NVIDIA driver. NVIDIA may no longer support a card as old as he has. That was when he was asking about if I think he had a 79 or 9800 GT, and was that good enough for Linux? We actually had quite a few emails on both of those topics, and most people pointing out that yes, trim is supported in Linux. You just have to make sure it's supported by both the file system you use, ext4, and the kernel. And as Ben points out, 2.6.33 is where that happens. So if you've installed it on both of those instances, you should be good to go and take advantages of trim. So that's good information to have.
Thank you so much, Ben. Brent, getting back to Brent, sorry about skipping around. He says, I can't decide between a mid or full-size case for my PC build in September. I want room to run dual large graphics cards and at least 4 drives. I plan to use a contained CPU liquid cooler, but everything else air-cooled. Could I fit all of that easily into a good Midtower case? In part, that depends on how well laid out the interior of the Midtower is. one, you want to make sure it's got room enough for full-length GPUs. As long as it's an ATX, on one hand, it doesn't really matter because all mid-tower should fit an ATX motherboard. ... Not all mid-tower ATX cases, however, are equal in terms of their use of space. I've seen some. It's been a while but I've seen some that had somehow they would manage to squirrel away six 3.5-inch hard drive slots along with a pair or 3 5.25-inch drive slots. Most of the time now, it seems to be one of those things where if you can get the case, look at the inside of the case, see what the layout is, see how many drives it supports. I have a couple full tower cases I inherited. Or conspired to liberate when a friend of mine was done with them. These huge Dell looked like a Cylon kind of bright red cases.
Yeah.
But I gotta say, if if space is at a premium, I tend to go to the mid tower.
Yeah, and you're right. That's one of those terms like full tower, mid tower. They're not really defined by anything that I know of. I don't think there's a height restriction or a dimension restriction at all. For instance, we have the Corsair 600T, the white version, sitting right in front of me. It's why it came to my mind. It has 6 internal 3.5-inch drive bays, 4 external 5.25-inch drive bays, and room for 8 expansion slots. So it will support 3-way SLI. That kind of thing as well. Actually, I guess it could technically go 4 graphics cards. So in terms of it's labeled as a mid-tower case on Newegg and on Amazon and those types of places, but it's got a lot of room inside there. When I think of full tower, I think of something that's, I don't know, coming up to my waist almost these days, right?
Something reminds you of a small European sports car along the Fiat, 600 lines.
You remember the cases that had to have the wheel? They were so big they had to have the caster wheels on them to move them around and that kind of stuff.
Houses.
The Dell that's what I think of as full tower cases. Almost everything, like the Corsair 800D, 700D, I'll take cases. Those are considered full tower cases, and they are taller than this, but they're not enormously so. Much like the ones that I remember back from the early 2000s type of thing. Right. So I guess long story short is it depends on your mid-tower case, but I don't think that should be a problem. If you're just talking about two graphics cards and 4 hard drives,
that's actually pretty modest.
Yeah,
especially if you plan on spending $100 on a case. A $30 case, it's probably going to be pretty bare inside of there. It'll probably be like a single poorly thought out drive cage, maybe 2 and a couple 5.25-inch slots.
Yep.
I'd also say if you feel like taking the pains, try to find a screwdriver-free case when possible, because it'll make a huge amount of difference if you go in and out of the case a lot. Removable panels on the side, drop panels for replacing CPU coolers. It's like a little square behind the CPU that allows you to remove the hardware that holds the CPU cooler down. And if you're actually in a store with a big array of cases, take a look and feel around inside to see whether the edges are sharp or not.
Maybe don't just cover your eyes and reach in and see if you come out with any cuts. Maybe you should look first.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea.
Feel the edges, see if they're rounded, see if the...
But you know where I'm going here. You've reached inside of a case and come back and gone, hospital, not hospital.
I have scars on my arms from cases, like not just cuts, but permanent scars on my arms from cases. So yes, I've often had what's that red stuff on my motherboard? Oh, that's blood from my hand that I didn't know was bleeding from. That's awesome.
I'm telling you, you get older, you just get more irritated by the scars inflicted by inanimate hardware.
Got an email from Bill about smart response technology. That's Intel's SSD caching stuff. He says, I just ordered a new Core i7 Z68 and SSD caching system and was wondering if there was a failure in the SSD part of the system, which seems to be a concern. Would the system continue to operate with reduced performance? Would an SSD failure cause data loss? I can imagine disk writes going to both hard drives and SSD in parallel, but don't know how smart response operates. Sorry if you have already talked about this and I missed it. I don't think this is anything we have talked about before, is it, Patrick? The idea of having a caching system and then the SSD dying?
Yeah, no, that's actually absolutely, it's not something we've touched on before. We've talked about various ways of implementing cache. We talked about MSAT on the motherboard. We've talked about large amounts of memory caching, information for application launches in Windows 7. But no, we have not discussed the Z68 caching system and what happens if it fails.
So first, the worst news. If your spinning disk fails, it's just like your hard drive died completely. The good news is, all things, from what I know, this is something I can probably test here and tell you by next week. I can just unplug the SSD while it's running. An SSD failure should not cause data loss. It is only a cache, right? It's only meant to improve read performance. It's not meant to improve write performance necessarily. Now, what the driver does necessarily when it writes, I'm not 100% sure, but my guess is that as the controller gets a write from the system, it will actually distribute it to the hard drive first, maybe both. Maybe it's smart enough to know if that data needs to be updated on the SSD and the spinning disk drive. My somewhat educated, mildly educated guess would be that you will not notice your system won't crash probably, and you probably won't lose any data if your SSD dies, but you will, as you hypothesized, continue to operate with reduced performance. And I can actually put in a request here later today, and I'm sure we've got a couple of those systems up and running, and just start doing some stuff and unplug an SSD and see what happens. I think that's actually a very good bit of information to have. And Bill, I will make a note here and make sure we check back with you next week on that, just to be 100% sure. But I'm thinking you will be okay.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
David in Sydney has a question about auto-detect game settings. He says, I'd really like to hear you guys speculate on the following. Why is it that auto-detect features within games always pick such lame graphics settings? Because they generally always work. 2, should I hesitate to crank the settings beyond those suggested? Even if an all in-game motion appears silky smooth, is there a chance that I am giving myself a competitive disadvantage? Thanks for the great show, David in Sydney. And thank you, David. You can always experiment with the settings. You should experiment with the settings. Should we get into the whole 60 frames per second on your LCD versus whether or not there's a competitive advantage to having it attempting to render 180 frames per second, inside the machine?
I mean, that is a very specific point, and we can get into that. I mean, that's the case, right? I mean.
Right. Frame rates uber alles.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, first question. Why do auto detect features suck? I mean, I think they usually go for the lowest common denominator and try to make sure the game is going to run on your system.
That is the case. It's also the case. The game that I think is most egregious at this is our Valve titles, Left 4 Dead, right. Left 4 Dead 2, anything by Valve. What they basically do is, if they don't recognize the graphics card in your system,
and they very often don't,
and they very, very often don't, they are going to bottom out those settings, right? So if I put in, let's say, a GTX 580 with a driver that the Valve game system doesn't, or that the Valve system doesn't understand,
right.
It will default me to 1024 by 768 and all settings to low. When obviously the GTX 580, which is a $400-something graphics card available today, is capable of maxing out every possible setting in that game. So it really comes down to the auto detect. Valve is actually a little bit better as they update it, kind of on a quarterly, maybe semi-annual basis, where they'll say, okay, the whole GTX 500 series has come out. We know what those are generally capable of. But a lot of it is, as Patrick is saying, it's really more of a, let's make sure that the consumer gets a very good experience out of the box with this, that they aren't what's the general rule of thumb here is, if a customer calls support line, you've just erased all the profit from that game that you just sold them plus 10 others or something like that. So you definitely don't want people complaining on the phone or in your forums or something like that. So that's probably why they're lowest, even a little bit lower than you might want, even if they auto detect it correctly.
Right.
So the second part is, should you play with those settings, Patrick?
Absolutely. Every chance you get. Yeah, no, I mean, that's, experiment with that. Experiment with the settings of your graphics controller, your GPU. Just make sure you remember where the reset to, factory default switch is.
Yeah. Those are important.
But, the only way, the only way, though, to see if you lose your competitive advantage by playing with the settings is, chances are, most people aren't as good as they think they are at video games. I know I suck, so I'm always shocked and amazed when I frag somebody. It makes me really happy. But, experiment with the settings. If you suddenly go from, like, being the king of the hill to getting your ass shot by everything on that level, okay, throttle the settings back down again. But, for most of the settings, we keep saying this, for most people with a 1920 by 1080 monitor or lower resolution, if you have a graphics card you bought in the last year and spent more than $100 on it, chances are the GPU can pump more pixels in that screen that it knows what to do with. So start playing around with the settings and see what you like, see what you don't like, and if you suddenly find yourself getting shot constantly in your favorite video game, dial them back down again.
Yeah, I tend to think what a lot of people do is people that I'm one of these. I'm kind of guilty of this. I like eye candy. I like all these features. I will find myself maybe stressing the system a little bit more than I should, because it looks better as I keep improving things. And I look at the frame counter, I'm running fraps in the corner. I was like, oh, okay, 60. Okay, now it's running 45. 45 is still pretty good. And then you'll find a place in the game where it kind of chugs. Where you're like, now you're down into the 30s. You don't like it very much. So it's usually better to like find a place where you think you're comfortable, maybe back off one or two settings and enjoy it all the way through. There's nothing worse than maybe in a very important part of the game and it kind of like chugging along with you as the giant boss that you've been chasing for the whole game.
Always
on the screen.
A boss level, because they put so many polygons inside the boss.
Very nice.
Yeah, that's always a terrible, terrible feeling. So last week I asked everybody, did you want us to talk about tablets at all? Because tablets are for so many people becoming a very important computing tool, whether they're running iOS, Android, or in the very near future, Windows 8. Right. And Ryan tabulated these. He said, many no's, but many more yeses, but with a focus on hardware specifically.
Yeah, it was. There were a lot of no's. I get a lot of tablets everywhere else. Right. There were at least a handful of those, but there were a lot of people, and there were some people that said, yes, definitely cover tablets. I'd say the happy medium we got in all these responses were, yes, cover tablets. Don't focus on them so much as a user experience type review type thing, and mostly kind of, we're a hardware show. Focus on the hardware, focus on the chips and what makes things interesting. Compare tablets to each other from a hardware perspective. I assume talking about interesting things like Cal-L, quad-core frequencies that they're running at, how improved these ARM-based GPUs are over what Qualcomm offers, and those types of things are totally in line with what we want. And then, last week we showed off the ePad transformer and talked about it for, I don't know, I think actually it was timed because there was a YouTube clip that Tony put up of like 1 minute and 15 seconds. So, we'll kind of find a balance in there, but I think it would be disingenuous to try to ignore that, like it wasn't right. Computer hardware. It is absolutely computer hardware. This Lenovo ThinkPad that I'm on there, most people would probably not want to game on, right? The hardcore gaming enthusiasts, but it's very important to what we do. So I think it makes sense.
As do I. I'm also an avid tablet user, so it's been interesting watching the Android stuff kind of come up to speed so fast. It'll be interesting to see where it is by Christmas. Yep. That, and it'll be interesting to see if I can afford my next SSD by Christmas. What's coming up on PC Per this week, Ryan?
Oh, goodness. We actually have a couple of tablet and mobile phone reviews, ironically enough. We are going to have a review of the ePad Transformer, Nexus S, as well as our first kind of experience with Windows Phone 7, interestingly enough. But we do have, I believe we have some new 6-panel output cards, again, we're going to look at, as well as, I think next week, some NDAs lift on those like Revo Drive, PCI Express-based solid-state disks. Nice. Or I guess they're not disks, solid-state drives. So that should be pretty interesting if you're talking about saving up money for SSDs. How about on Techzilla? What do you guys got coming up?
It's been an interesting couple of weeks because we've transitioned from a recording to tape and then post-production to live to drive, as we call it. So we there's like no news like over the next couple episodes because we taped them a couple weeks ago, but we actually are talking about what to do when your router breaks the internet, talking about DNS and some of the other errors that pop up with routers, experimenting with Netflix to improve the settings. The LG's newest round of affordable HDTVs are actually looking really good. Robert Heron did a review of that, and we had a lot of fun on a shoot dealing with like speaker hum or subwoofer hum, talking about ground loops and the legendary evil coax hum, which is caused by some connections, improperly grounded connections. It's a little different from a ground loop, but if your satellite or cable TV is jacked up, I got really kind of fascinated by this. That and Danny Fukubo, who's part of the UNA on Kickstarter. He's our former intern. He and a couple guys got together to do a Kickstarter project. They got like 1,000% funding to do a iPhone stand, kind of a universal iPhone stand detachment carrier device. And they got 131,000 in funding on UNA for a project they thought they were going to get like, $3 or $4 grand to put together. So it's been interesting to watch some of the stuff that's popping up on Kickstarter lately.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, also, but I think Danny's like, oh my goodness, I may have a career. I don't think he's leaving his job doing designing solar cell systems, but he's pretty excited. Twitch, TWICH at twit.tv is the email address, and we definitely want you to send us emails. At Ryan Shrout is Mr. Shrout's Twitter. I'm at Patrick Norton on the Twitter. We'd love to hear from you on there too. You know what? More questions, more news next week. And actually, somewhere around here, I'll have my Energizer portable battery, which has been interesting to experiment with. A relatively affordable portable power supply that doesn't require you to build it yourself, since I've usually done that in the past. Until next week, I'm Patrick Norton.
And I'm Ryan Shrout.
Till then, we'll see you on Twitch. You're taking 880 up to Oakland, and 880 is a nightmare. 880 is actually in some ways worse.
Did they finish the bridge yet?
No, they expect to finish it earlier, but they're still looking at like 2013.
Awesome.
Well, it's been crazy. They built. I wonder if I have the picture on here. I desperately want to climb it. They have a 350-foot catwalk up to the central tower on the new east stand of the Bay Bridge. And
Are you supposed to be allowed to climb it?
No, I'm pretty sure if I was caught up there, I would be shot by the Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah, don't do that then.
But there was a period of time there. Yeah, I don't know if you can. Probably can't really. Yeah, that's showing up really well on the camera there. That's like a gigantic tower that's a span, and there's this orange catwalk that's like 6 feet wide and like 400 feet long.
Nice.
But it's been
Get a good carabiner for you.
Yeah, believe me, I would be harnessed. We actually had some really good plans on how to poach the Golden Gate towers, because we figured out a way to get around the gates to prevent people from climbing them. And then 9/11 happened, and we decided we probably did not want to be caught illicitly climbing onto high anything involving massive amounts of public transportation and infrastructure in the community. So
nice.
I was supposed to learn that in grade school, but I never learned the rhyme.
January, February.
30 days has September, April, June, and November.
What's the finger trick?
Top of knuckle, January, February, March, April, May, June, July. And the top of the knuckle is 31 days.
January, February, May, June, July. Wow.
First of all, you also forgot March, but...
Well, counting was never my strong point. Hi, I'm an English major. How are you?
I was an engineering major. See how much that helps me here. All right.
On that bright and cheerful note.
Yep. I'll figure it out. I'll try to get out there sometime.
You let me know when you're coming out here. I will get up to the cottage to tape with you.
Looking forward
Sounds
to seeing
good.
you.
Yay.